The story of the Black Lives Matter movement begins long before the phrase itself was ever spoken. To understand why the movement exists, one must look deep into the centuries of racial injustice, slavery, segregation, and systemic inequality that shaped life for black people in America. The roots of this struggle stretch back to the arrival of enslaved Africans in the early 1600s, when the first ships brought men, women, and children to the colonies as forced laborers. From that moment, black life in America was defined by survival, resilience, and resistance against oppression. The institution of slavery built the foundation of America's economic power, but it also embedded racial hierarchy into the nation's social and political systems. When slavery was finally abolished after the Civil War in 1865, freedom came without equality. Black Americans were technically free, but new forms of control quickly took the place of chains. The Jim Crow laws that swept across the South enforced segregation, denying black citizens the right to vote, own property freely, or receive equal education and justice. For decades, these laws legalized discrimination, and those who resisted faced violence from white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Throughout the 20th century, the fight for civil rights gained momentum. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, and countless others led marches, sit-ins, and protests demanding justice and equality. Their courage inspired generations, but despite the victories of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, deep racial disparities remained. The laws changed, but the systems that enforced inequality evolved into more subtle, yet equally destructive forms. Police brutality became one of the most visible symbols of this continuing struggle. From the beating of Rodney King in 1991 to countless unarmed black men and women killed by police, each incident revealed that racism was not a thing of the past, it was alive, woven into institutions of power. The spark that ignited the Black Lives Matter movement came in 2013, after the tragic death of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. Trayvon, an unarmed black teenager, was walking home from a convenience store in Sanford, Florida, when he was followed and shot by a neighborhood watch volunteer named George Zimmerman. Zimmerman claimed self-defense, and when he was acquitted of all charges, the decision devastated millions of people. For many black Americans, it was a painful reminder that their lives were still seen as expendable in the eyes of the justice system. In response, 3 women, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, took to social media to express their grief and anger. Alicia Garza wrote a heartfelt post ending with the phrase, "Black Lives Matter." Patrisse Cullors turned that phrase into a hashtag, Black Lives Matter, and Opal Tometi helped spread it online. The killing of George Floyd became a global turning point, not only for the United States but for humanity's understanding of race and justice. Millions of people filled the streets, carrying signs that said, "No justice, no peace, say their names," and "Black Lives Matter." What made these protests extraordinary was not only their size but their diversity. People of every race, age, and background came together, united by a shared sense of outrage and empathy. The streets of New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and Washington echoed with chants demanding justice, while similar demonstrations unfolded across Europe, Africa, Asia, and Australia. For the first time in decades, the entire world was talking openly about systemic racism, police violence, and the legacy of colonialism. The phrase, "Black Lives Matter," was painted on streets, displayed in storefronts, and spoken in parliaments. Even major corporations and sports leagues released statements supporting the cause, though many were criticized for doing so superficially. The 2020 movement was different because it was fueled not just by anger but by technology. Social media transformed the protests into a global conversation that couldn't be censored or ignored. Live streams from Minneapolis reached audiences in real time. Hashtags trended across continents. Artists, athletes, and public figures used their platforms to amplify the message. The movement's visual power, murals, photographs, and videos, became part of history itself. The faces of victims like George Floyd and Breonna Taylor became symbols of an unfinished struggle for justice. In the midst of a global pandemic, when people were already isolated and anxious, this moment of collective grief and solidarity gave them purpose. Protesters marched despite the risk of illness, wearing masks that carried the message, "I can't breathe." As the protests spread, authorities responded with a mix of concession and resistance. Some cities promised to reform police departments, banning chokeholds and increasing accountability. Others met protesters with tear gas, rubber bullets, and mass arrests. The irony was not lost on anyone: people protesting police violence were being met with more police violence. This only reinforced the movement's message. Despite attempts to discredit it, Black Lives Matter remained grounded in nonviolent resistance, community organization, and education. It encouraged people to learn about systemic racism, question their biases, and demand change in their schools, workplaces, and governments. The movement's influence reached far beyond policing. It ignited a cultural and intellectual awakening. Institutions began re-examining their histories. Museums, universities, and companies faced pressure to confront their roles in perpetuating inequality. Statues of slave traders and Confederate generals were toppled or removed across the world. Books about racism and history soared to the top of bestseller lists. Conversations about the years after the height of the protests marked a new chapter for the Black Lives Matter movement, one defined not by the volume of crowds but by the depth of its influence. The fires that once lit the streets had transformed into quieter but steadier flames of reform, reflection, and rebuilding. What began as an outcry against police brutality had become a cultural revolution that challenged how people thought about justice, power, and equality. Though the mass demonstrations had subsided, their spirit continued to shape public life in ways that would have seemed unimaginable a decade earlier. The phrase, "Black Lives Matter," was no longer just a slogan, it had become part of the moral vocabulary of the world. It appeared in classrooms, on murals, in political debates, and even in corporate mission statements. Every time it was spoken, it carried with it the memory of struggle and the demand for recognition. It forced individuals and institutions to reconsider their own roles in perpetuating inequality. Schools began revising history curricula to include discussions about systemic racism. Museums launched exhibitions exploring the Black experience. Art galleries filled their walls with pieces inspired by resistance and resilience. What had once been considered a radical idea, acknowledging structural racism, was now part of the mainstream dialogue. But progress, as history shows, never comes without resistance. As Black Lives Matter gained influence, backlash intensified. Politicians and media figures who opposed the movement sought to downplay its importance, claiming that the country had already achieved equality and that discussions about race were divisive. Laws were introduced in several states to limit how race and racism could be taught in schools, often under the guise of protecting national unity. Conservative movements tried to brand diversity and inclusion initiatives as political indoctrination. Yet for every attempt to silence the message, new voices rose to defend it. Young activists, especially from marginalized communities, took inspiration from the movement's courage. They applied its lessons to other struggles, for gender equality, LGBTQ+ rights, immigrant justice, and indigenous sovereignty, proving that the call for justice knows no boundaries. At the local level, the impact of Black Lives Matter was profound. City councils across the United States began reviewing police budgets, creating oversight committees, and investing in social services. Some neighborhoods launched community policing initiatives designed to build trust rather than fear. Grassroots organizations offered legal aid, mental health support, and youth mentorship programs that reflected the movement's vision of community empowerment. These initiatives demonstrated that justice was not only about punishing wrongdoing but also about creating conditions where everyone could live in safety and dignity. Internationally, the movement inspired similar reckonings.